What's up, writers? Did you know that authors of stories, just like you are, and just like the authors of the books you read right now, they all plan out their story using all the tools they have, like a story arc. Let's go. Writers, here's the deal. We need to really be aware of what our story shape is taking. I know that you've been shown things like story mountains before, where we look at the internal things going on inside your character or your story, and the external things. But in all of those story shapes, they all go like this. And that's it. And I'm here to show you that that's not all there is in writing. Not all stories take that shape. And right now, we're going to look at 5 examples of how a story could go, the shape it would take, and an example of what story would fit with that one. They're all 5 from a very famous author you probably have never heard of, but maybe when you get older you will, named Kurt Vonnegut. Let's check it out. So, the first story arc is called Man in a Hole. But it doesn't have to be about a man in a hole. It's just simply somebody got in trouble or gets into trouble and then gets out of it again. It's not an accident that the line that you're seeing in front of you on my screen, on our screen, it's not an accident that the line ends up higher than where it began. This is encouraging to readers. So in other words, you start here, and this is like average, you're like really excited, things get way worse real quickly, and then they end up better than they were to begin with. Story arc number 2. Boy meets a girl. So this is another story arc where it doesn't actually have to be what the title says. It's not necessarily a boy meeting a girl. It's this. So somebody who's an ordinary person on a day like any other day, comes across something perfectly wonderful, and they think, this is my lucky day. However, some sort of mishap occurs. Something happens that they didn't anticipate, where the person falls down. Something bad happens to them. They need to get themselves back up out of it. And in the end, they do. They prevail. They come up on top. Boy meets girl. So, this next one is going to be really familiar to you. Someone starts off really low. If you look at our previous 2 examples, one started off really high, one was in the middle. Now this one starts off really low. They start off where things have been terrible for them. And from the start of the story, everything just gets a little bit better, a little bit better, a little bit better. And it gets to a point where it like almost peaks. And we think, this is awesome. But then it drops. Something bad happens. And they kind of flatline. And then finally, something at the end of the story picks it way back up. And they think, here we go. This is it. Their life is going to be better from now on, no matter what happens. A story that fits with that is Cinderella. If we think about it, in the beginning, life couldn't be worse. Her mom died, her dad remarried this terrible human being, and her awful, awful stepchildren. Well, wouldn't you know it, but something positive happens. Just little things get better and better and better. To the point where she's supposed to go to this dance. But wouldn't you know it, those evil, terrible human beings that are in her life tell her she can't go. They have chores for her to do. She's going to stay at home. And so it drops back down. Not quite to where it was before, but she's down in the dumps. And that good old fairy grandmother fixes everything. And up and up and up, we get to the dance. She leaves behind the shoe. She is with the prince. Everything is perfect. And at this point, no matter what happens, life is going to be great. We know how the story goes. She ends up having to leave before midnight. And in her mind, she's always going to remember this excellent moment that happened to her, no matter what happens. And it's important when you're looking at these pictures in front of you that you pay attention to when the story begins on the left, when the story ends on the right, on the bottom where it says ill fortune, as in bad things are happening, and the top where it says good fortune, good things are happening. And you notice it changes over the course of time from the beginning to the end of the story. Okay, 2 story arcs that I'm just going to talk about real quickly because you're not going to need them and use them because they're a little bit weird. The story arc 4 is Kafka. This is the name of an author. And basically the story arc is like this. Right? Not a story that you probably want to write about. In other words, things are really bad. And then they just fall off a cliff and get worse and they'll never get better again. Right? I know. Not very rosy. I mean, think about it. I doubt you should use it. The last one, story arc 5, is kind of Shakespearean. In other words, the story ends up not really going anywhere. It's here in the middle. And the reason why that's even a story arc is because it's not focused so much on where we go. It's focused on the big truth. And Shakespeare stories often have those big truths in them, like an example of Hamlet. Okay, writers, let's take a look at our story that we've already read 13 and a half. Okay, writers. So this story that we read 13 and a half was like that. It's got that traditional up, down, finish the story off in a satisfactory way. In the beginning, it starts with the narrator going to Ashley's big, fancy house. And we learn some more about her along the way, the 2 characters. Next, Ashley gives the narrator a tour and makes up a lot of rules about, like, that's my brother's bedroom, don't go in there. Talks about marmallows or whatever they were called. Next, the narrator feels uncomfortable. So notice, remember, this line is going up, and as we continue, the narrator feels more and more of whatever they kind of felt in the beginning, which was uncomfortable. This is awkward. Why am I doing this? Next, Ashley talks a lot about her getting older and also her exotic bird, which our narrator can't really relate to. She's basically like, yeah, I don't really think about that kind of stuff, and why would I want a bird? Increasing our level of like, this is weird. Okay, at the climax of our story, the story where nothing could get weirder, it would seem, Ashley and the narrator find the bird dead. It's a little sweet pea, dead down the bottom of the cage. But that's not all. Even though this is like the event, things still do get weirder from here. The mother actually explains to the daughter, Ashley, that sweet pea's not what she thought it was. It is one of many birds she's had. Okay, very weird now. The weirdest probably it gets, maybe. The narrator wants to leave, but ends up staying. But she does go downstairs and sits by herself in the kitchen, and the mom turns out to be like kind of a weirdo. Next, Ashley and the narrator hold a funeral. Yes, a funeral for a dead bird in their backyard with a box that plays music, or at least it looks like it could. So even though we didn't think it could be weirder, it's gotten weirder. There is no more like shocking things that happen, which is why the biggest shock is there at the climax. The most surprising thing happens there. But now we're starting to level off. Things aren't getting weirder. This weirdness has changed our character. The narrator is actually kinder now to Ashley, and she appreciates her life more. So if we're looking at a realization or a change in our character at the end, there it is. That through this, the character is sort of like, sympathy. It doesn't straight up say it, but based upon the actions of the narrator, we can see it. Okay. Right now, in your journal, it's time for you to think about one way your story could go and put it on one of those story arcs that we just saw. I suggest thinking about what the big idea of your story is and plotting it along. You might not know what the peak is. You might not know what the beginning is. You might not really even know what the end is. For example, in this story, 13 and a half, I'm sure that the author had an idea for the worst play date ever, but she didn't know that the character was going to encounter going to this person's house she'd never really met, that the bird was going to be dead, and that she would actually learn this person is not so weird, I have sympathy for her and is kind for her, and turns out being kinder to her. In the beginning, it was the worst play date ever. So with your idea in your mind and you knowing your character really well, put them through their paces. Okay? Try out different story arcs to see how it might go. Your job is to get 2 different story arcs by the time that we meet next. Oh, before we forget, we need to add something to a journal page. On your journal page that's titled How to Write Compelling Fiction, we're going to add one new thing. So that means if you've moved on and you're writing digitally, you might need to copy this page from before and put it into this new journal that you're making. If you're writing by hand, hopefully everything's all there together and you just need to turn and go backward in some pages. Here's what we should see on this final entry for now for how to write compelling fiction. If you're missing anything else on there, please add them to your journal now. So you can see that from today's learning, in order to write compelling fiction, we need to plot several versions of your story, aiming to intensify the problem. Use arcs, timelines, and storyboards. So yes, even though I said that I want you to do 2 different story arcs, maybe you do a story arc and a timeline. But the purpose here is to end up with 2 different versions of the story. I'm going to read that to you again. Plot several versions of your story. It matters less what tool you use, and it matters more what versions you end up with. Well, we're at the end, and I think the thing that we really need to take from this is, as the story goes, as we plot it out on our story arc, no matter what it looks like, the problem needs to intensify. Maybe it intensifies going down like that, like Man in a Hole, and it just gets intensely bad and worse and worse. Or maybe it is more up like this, right? As the story goes on, things just get a little weirder and weirder. Or maybe things in the beginning are awful. And they slowly get better. But we want to think about intensifying our problem. And while we've seen those 3 story arcs, there's probably one that you feel most comfortable using. And if it looks most like 13 and a half, then you use that 13 and a half one. But I really want you to try out one of those other ones you saw. Okay? Now, the thing that you should think about is the way our story arc looked for 13 and a half. In some ways, it's a little bit opposite. In some ways, it is actually a little similar to Man in a Hole, because we start off here and then we just go down, and we probably end up a little bit higher than we were in the beginning. So in some ways, it's a reversed Man in the Hole. But whatever you do, we want 2 story arcs and be thinking about 2 different ones. It may not be exactly following them, but we want them to change how your story ends up looking. Okay. Until I see you next time, happy writing.